Hello everyone, and welcome to our week one kind of review video here. As we're going to go through your reflection activities, we're going to go through the primary source document that you answered. And really these review videos are going to be kind of combining and pointing out what you, the students, had brought into the conversation, as well as adding it to some reflections and points that I would like to make and more information that I would like to add in. And in a lot of ways, these are going to be some very important parts to close the feedback loop in the class. As you're going to kind of see the kind of answers I was looking for, you're going to be able to kind of judge how your answers fit in with what I'm presenting here. You'll get an idea of answers that the rest of the class were providing, and it should give you a pretty solid idea as far as how your work fit in with kind of the learning that we're doing here with the rest of the class. At the same point in time, since I'll be going through all of the reflection activities, you'll be able to get an idea and a sense of the answers to some of the questions that you chose not to answer, which is still a good way for you to get a lot of that information. So it's a very good idea for you to go through and watch these videos on a weekly basis. Also, if you have any questions about maybe why you lost a few points on a particular question, watching these videos is going to be a good way to kind of see what I was looking for and compare it to with what your responses were. I try to provide some basic feedback to everyone on your assignments themselves. It's more difficult to do that with the primary source documents. But if you ever have any questions about a grade you received, please contact me and let me know, because I'll give you a much more thorough breakdown as far as what I was looking for, maybe where some of those points got taken off, and what you can do better next time to get a better grade. So that's the most important thing to remember, that combining the review videos with the feedback I leave, combined with any other questions you might have, it's going to how you're going to really be able to understand the feedback and how you did. And any questions you have should be able to be answered with that combination of things. All right, so starting off here, we'll just go ahead and go through these, starting with number one. So pros and cons. List some of the advantages and disadvantages of agriculture. Why do you think the practice became so widely adopted? Then think about your own daily life and how much of the way you live is thanks to the Neolithic Revolution. So let's start off with some of the advantages. Obviously, the advantages of agriculture was a more stable food supply, right? That you're able to plant crops, you're able to domesticate animals to help with those crops or to use for food or materials in other ways, and that you can stay in one location, leading to what is known as the sedentary lifestyle, right? Sedentary habitation, that as opposed to having to continually move like the hunter and gatherer peoples that we have been, you learned a little bit about in the beginning of the chapter, which is pretty much the way that humans have lived for about the first 90% of human history. That this shift to agriculture allowed for people to stay put in a way that they never had been before. And of course, this leads to a couple of very important kind of other items that kind of all build off of this idea of having a stable food supply in one location and being able to live and stay in one location, which a lot of what we come to think of as civilization is really kind of built upon those two things. Because when you're going and constantly moving around in these small hunter and gatherer societies, it's very hard to sustain a population of over, say, 30 to 50 people, which means that a lot of the other kind of more complex elements that eventually come to kind of define what we kind of sort of think of as civilization are really hard to get going. One of the first really important ideas is the idea of storage and surplus. With hunting and gathering groups, of course, you kill an animal, you divide it up for meat. It uses bones, its hides for clothing, and for other materials. But there's not a lot that you can save. You're always limited to what you can carry with you because you're always moving. So you're pretty much limited to, maybe 150, 200 pounds. Of course, you can set up, kind of camps and go out and carry less with you, but you're eventually going to have to come back to that camp, pack it up, keep following the herds, and keep moving. With storage and surplus, that means that not only can people stay in one location, but they can start building up reserves for the future in case something happens, in case there's a bad harvest. And at the same point in time, as we'll be talking about in a moment, another really important idea of surplus is that you start having the creation of the idea of wealth, which is one of the key distinctions of eventually having more hierarchy within societies, more social stratification. We'll be talking more about that in a moment. But the idea that you can sit in one location, that you can build up these food supplies and actually start storing them is pretty important. Another very important idea for sedentary habitation is that you can start having a more intimate relationship with your immediate environment in a way that you're not necessarily going to be able to have if you're constantly moving from one location to another. Certainly, you're very in tune with your environment in that kind of a scenario of a hunter and gatherer lifestyle as well. But once you're in a stable, set location, you can start really, for example, figuring out what rocks are in the local rock deposits and start mining those, start taking advantage and building up a surplus once again of those kind of local resources, which will eventually come into play when you start running into other people from other locations who have surpluses of things around them, which you can then start kind of exchanging with one another. And this is one of the big keys to the sort of early trade systems that spring up after the advent of agriculture and the creation of these smaller villages. Of course, one of the most important aspects is higher birth rates, which eventually leads to larger populations. The large populations of the world that we see today in villages, in towns, in cities, is all based upon the Neolithic Revolution and the creation and utilization of agriculture. Because like I said, with the constant moving, tracking herds, typically you can't get much more than 50 people in one of these groups before it's very difficult to sustain. And eventually, once it gets that time, most of these hunter and gatherer groups would break off into separate groups and kind of go their separate ways. Suddenly now with agriculture, you can start having higher populations than you ever could before, which in turn sort of leads to more and more complex societies as we go along, just necessitated by having more and more people all trying to live and to work and to cooperate together. So those are some of the things that people identified and what you should be thinking of when you're thinking of advantages to agriculture. Agriculture, though, also comes with a lot of disadvantages that we see. First of all, if you're in one set location, you're a lot more vulnerable to natural disasters, that your crops can get wiped out. You don't have anything else to eat. If you don't have enough in your surplus or your storage, your family, the village, or whatever could starve. If there's going to be an earthquake, a volcano, something else like that. If you're in a hunter-gatherer group, you can just pick up and leave, right? And keep following the herds. As long as the herds can keep going, and as long as the animals are okay, you're going to be okay. Much harder to do that if you're tied down to one specific location. So you're a lot more vulnerable in a certain sense to these kind of natural whims of fate. And you can really see this further on in the material this week when you're talking about the Mesopotamians and their relationship with their kind of very chaotic rivers that left them very kind of vulnerable to these natural disasters, and as you can see in a lot of ways deeply impacted the sort of pessimistic culture that developed there. Also, another thing that we see, interestingly enough, with agriculture is that typically you need more man hours and harder work to provide food for people, which surprises a lot of people. A lot of people would think that it'd actually be kind of more labor intensive and more difficult, constantly having to look for food, looking for berries, herbs, natural vegetables, things of that nature, and gathering those together. That you'd think that'd be more work. Actually, planting, weeding, irrigation, harvesting, all the processes that go into agriculture, watching herds, constantly having to keep an eye out on your herds, making sure they're not going to be attacked by animals or stolen by other people. All this leads into the fact that agriculture in the long run ends up being a lot more tedious and creates and takes a lot more time to produce as many calories for a group of people. Now, in to a certain sense, this is kind of counterintuitive because what you eventually see happening with the idea of kind of storage and surplus is that certain people are more or less designated to these long hours and this hard work, where other groups of people are able to kind of take advantage of that and not have to do any at all. Which is in a situation in a hunter and gatherer group, you don't see that nearly as much. Pretty much everyone is going out and performing generally the same activities, right? Whether it's hunting or gathering, there's not a lot of differentiation of labor, which is another idea we're going to be talking about in a moment here. Where there is much more so in these sedentary agricultural societies, but increasingly that work is kind of relegated to a certain class of people, whether it's people who are enslaved, whether it's just a lower class of society, that a certain set group of people are creating and producing the food to support other people who can go on to do other things, whether it's fighting in an army, whether it's being a king or part of a government, or whether it's being a philosopher or a priest or fulfilling a different role within society. But the fact is that there's still a lot of people having to put in the vast majority of their time and work very hard to create and produce enough calories to support society in a way that you really didn't have in hunter and gatherer societies. Also, and particularly when we're talking about these kind of early agricultural societies, the nutritional value goes down when people start relying on just a few plants and a few crops. For example, they have less meat in their diet, they have less variety of the natural herbs and natural plant resources that they used to have in hunting and gathering. Also, a overdependence on things like grains, which forms the basis of a lot of these early agricultural societies. Not all of them, but a lot of them can eventually lead to dental problems as well. And you see the kind of the teeth in the physical remains of people living at this time period be much more worse off than their hunter and gatherer predecessors. So the health of people really kind of declines, and the prevalence of diseases factors into this as well. People generally get less healthy when they go from hunting and gathering groups to go into these agricultural societies. And a big part of that is diseases, and one of the main reasons why these diseases become so prevalent is, first of all, you have people living in close proximity to one another, so when one person catches a germ or a bug, it's very quickly to spread to a much larger group of people than it had previously been. And also, a lot of the most virulent diseases that we have today were actually spread to people by animals, and that domestication process as a part of agriculture very heavily plays into this. So you think of things like the chicken pox, for example, or measles, influenza, things like that. A lot of those were originally spread to people from animals, and people living in close proximity to animals for the first time through this process of domestication and agriculture leads to people becoming a lot more susceptible to these diseases than they previously had been. The big kind of exception to this is that higher birth rates do still occur. Slightly more people just because it's easier for women throughout their pregnancy in these sedentary agricultural societies. Are not having to move quite as much. They're able to be in a kind of safer location a lot of times to give birth. Birth rates do actually increase, and the health of babies does slightly increase, even though until you get really to the modern era, that is still a very, very hazardous time of life. A large percentage of women die in childbirth, and the majority of children die before they reach the age of 5. But things do get slightly better in these agricultural societies, but there are still these other risks that do come in concerning people's health. And perhaps the greatest disadvantage is this idea of social stratification, right? The idea that there are now greater divisions within society that are being created through this process. And there's two main reasons why this occurs in this transition from hunting and gathering societies to agricultural societies. And the first one is this idea of storage and surplus. One of the things that you really need to have stratification is an idea or a concept of wealth. And there's really no way to get a great concept or idea of wealth when you're, limited to being able to carry, 70, 80 pounds, whatever, with you. I mean, there's no point in having a lot of gold or a lot of precious stones or jewels or anything like that if you can't really haul them around, because obviously you're going to be hauling things around like food and shelter and more important things to your life and your existence. Now that people can start staying in one location, they can start trading, they can start mining the resources that are around them to a greater degree, they can start building up surpluses of food. Some people can now start having more than others. And the second kind of main key to this idea of social stratification is the idea that there's a differentiation in labor, that some people are set to doing some jobs, while some people are doing other very different jobs. In a hunter and gatherer society, everyone's kind of doing the same activities. There might be someone might be a little bit better at making stone tools for hunting, so they might do that a little bit more. Someone else might be a little bit better at finding a particular kind of root, so they might go out and do that more, mushrooms or something like that. But typically, people are doing very similar functions within your societal group. When you get into agriculture in cities and the idea that some people are creating food, which creates other classes that can do stuff that are besides having to worry about procuring nutrition and nutrients and food for themselves, leads to people doing vastly different functions within society. Like I said, you have some people eventually kind of becoming the heads or the leaders of these groups as these societies get more and more complex. You have some people taking on more specific religious roles within these societies. Also, with the increasing complexity based around agriculture, you start having an increase in technology, which is another thing we'll be talking about in a moment here. So you have people then working, for example, being metallurgists or being leather goods or creating the tools you need for agriculture, which creates these different kind of jobs and different labor systems that people are going to be fulfilling. And in a lot of societies, as time goes on, you start seeing these become hardened into more definite classes, with some classes and some people being born into situations where they are just allowed access to more resources, whereas some people are not. And some people are kind of have the options or the ability to move into a wider variety or range of labor, or what we might eventually think of as occupations, while some people are relegated to just having to kind of be in this bottom rung of just production or slave labor, or what have you. Another thing we start seeing is a greater increase in a separation of gender roles during this time period, where men are expected to play very different functions than women. In hunter-gatherer societies, there was certainly a differentiation of labor. Men were a little bit more typical hunters, women were a little bit more general and gatherers, but the main goal and the main point of both of them in these activities was to bring in calories for the group, and oftentimes gathering brought in more calories than hunting did. And there's a lot of evidence, both from this time period and from modern hunter and gatherer groups, that women played a much greater and more prominent role within these groups, within these societies, more options and more ability to perform religious functions, to perform leadership functions. And that with agriculture, what you see developing is a greater increase in patriarchal structures, where men are increasingly tied to resource production, whereas women are increasingly tied to more domestic roles. This doesn't happen across the board, but is more common than not in these early agricultural societies, and you start seeing an increase of that, and that eventually becomes embedded in a lot of these cultures as we go forward. It gets embedded within the religion. It gets embedded within the kind of social classes, and it gets very much ingrained into how these societies operate and kind of their cultural norms that they eventually create and define. That being said, women are still going to be playing monumentally important roles throughout this course and throughout this class, and a lot of times it's women finding ways to operate and be productive, successful, and happy within a lot of times these kind of patriarchal systems, which are trying to sort of push them oftentimes to the margin. So given these advantages and these disadvantages, why was agriculture so widely adopted? Of course, eventually it becomes kind of what we think of today, pretty much what our entire modern world is built upon, right? So why is that? Because there do seem to be as many advantages there were, there does seem to be almost as many disadvantages that comes with it. It's easy to look back with the world we have today and say, oh, well, this must have been a really easy decision for people to make. But it's clear that in these kind of very early agricultural societies, there's a lot of pros and cons that people could have factored in. So one of the reasons that this shift became so widespread is that you got to remember and look at the way that agriculture first developed. One of the main ways that it developed was at the end of the last ice age. There was a lot of temperature fluctuation, and for a while the temperatures globally got very much warmer, and the environment got a lot wetter in a lot of places, which led to just a lot of naturally abundant local crops and plants that people could use. Now, this wasn't agriculture because a lot of these were still naturally growing, but there was enough local abundance that people were able to sort of do the sedentary lifestyle before the actual agriculture as far as planting and so forth. So people were living in one location, there was abundance of animals nearby, there's an abundance of plants nearby, and what you see happening is something called incipient agriculture, where people just start sort of dabbling in agriculture, right? Where they're not surviving, they're not depending on it. But, let's say there was a group of kind of wheat plants that were growing naturally close to your village, but you used up all the ones that were real close, so there's a little bit of walk to get to the ones that are a little bit farther away. Well, people started bringing some seeds back and planting these seeds next to their villages just to make it a little bit more convenient for them. And in the very wet and warm climate, they grew very well. And that over a time period, we're probably talking hundreds to, over 1,000 years, people became more and more dependent upon these plants and these crops, even though they didn't necessarily have all of what we'd consider agriculture down. Domestication is also playing a role at the same point in time as animals. When people are sedentary and staying in one location for a set period of time, it's a lot easier to create a corral, grab a few young animals and start trying to work with them and trade them and breed them from a young age, and to eventually create animals that are more willing to work with and be in close proximity to humans. So the sedentary lifestyle probably came a little bit for actually dependence on agriculture. What happens then is, given another couple thousand years, around 10,000 years ago or so, the climate changes once again, and the climate cools down globally, and a lot of those natural abundance by these kind of sedentary villages ends up drying up, and it goes much closer to what we might think of as kind of a normal culture or a normal environment. So when that happens, a lot of this natural abundance dries up, so a lot of the villages that were depending on that break up, they go back to being hunters and gatherers and so forth. But a few villages that began kind of dabbling in this incipient agriculture, who had planted, crops and so forth next to their villages, eventually were able to rely on that and grow on that to keep the larger populations that they had. And that's really one of the big things why it becomes so widely adopted, is that once you start depending on agriculture, once you start getting those larger populations within these villages, 100, 200, 500, 1,000 people, if you're talking about the Natufian villages, eventually up to Qaqortoq and so forth, once you're at that level, you're really in it for the long game. You can't just, unless you're going to completely break everything up and go your separate ways into these small hunting gathering groups, once you're dependent on agriculture, you have to keep going on it to sustain the higher population levels that you had. So once you're in it, it's a lot harder to kind of back out without some pretty catastrophic consequences. Also, there just seems to be an appeal for what is going to benefit higher birth rates within societies as well. One of the human beings are animals as well. One of the things that we're just naturally programmed to do is reproduce, and those aspects that are going to lead to higher success rates of reproduction are things that humans are going to just kind of naturally tend to gravitate towards. So the appeal of higher birth rates and the higher populations that are being spawned from them, I think, is another reason why you see agriculture being widely adopted. And finally, a lot of the disadvantages that people see around agriculture. For example, the nutrition, the increased diseases, the more hours and harder labor, natural disasters. A lot of these aren't really readily apparent, and they only become apparent over a protracted amount of time. I mean, everything in a village might seem fine until you do have a natural disaster come along. But, for a natural disaster that could actually threaten the existence of a village, that might be 100 years, it might be 200 years, it might be even longer. So you have a scenario where a lot of these, and for example, diseases are another really good example where people might be getting sick, but they don't realize it's because they're living in closer proximity. They don't realize it's because they're now living in closer proximity to animals. They just know that they're getting sick, but it's not something where they're going to make a conscious choice to say, well, we better break it all down, go back into our hunting and gathering groups and get with it. So I think those are a couple of the reasons why agriculture eventually does become so widely adopted, that the advantages are a lot more apparent than the disadvantages, and kind of once you're in and dependent upon agriculture, you just have to keep the process going. So how much of our daily life is thanks to the Neolithic Revolution? Well, for the vast majority of us who live in this country, and for most places around the world, nearly all of it. The very fact that we have so much differentiation in the labor and the occupations we have to this day, the fact that 99.99% of our societies are based upon agriculture and not hunting and gathering. There are still a few hunting and gathering cultures out there, but the vast majority of the world is now dependent in one shape or another on agriculture, and everything we think of today as far as our culture, our technology, and so forth really stems from the transition to agriculture during the Neolithic Revolution. So it's pretty hard to understate its importance. So that's why I spent a decent amount of time kind of breaking it down here. Alright, moving on to question number 2. 5 things. So what were the 5 most important ways that life changed during the Neolithic era? Make sure to explain why you selected these changes and why you feel they are the most important. I'm going to go through these quite a bit quicker than I went through the last question, because a lot of them are going to kind of be, answers that are very similar. For example, sedentary life, right? People going from constantly moving to living in one set location, higher populations. And once these populations increase, you start seeing people living in more towns, eventually the creation of cities within Mesopotamia, within Egypt. But one thing I really want to focus here on is this idea of trade. As trade becomes one of the big developments in the way that life changes through the Neolithic era. Prior to this, there was contact between these hunting and gathering groups, but it's suggested that a lot of times this contact was limited. First of all, people typically had very similar goods to trade, because everyone was living a very similar lifestyle. I mean, sure, someone might have had some stone that was good for tools from one location that another group did not, and there could be an exchange there. They might have had other kind of luxury items, beads and so forth, that they had that they could trade that another group did not have. But in general, everyone was living a very similar lifestyle. They all had very similar goods. Also, these groups, because they were small, they're oftentimes traveling around large areas, geographical areas, following these herds. There wasn't as much opportunity to encounter other groups. There was no way, or very few ways, to tell when a group was going to be in one typical location. I mean, there is evidence that some of these small hunter-gatherer groups got together perhaps at certain times of years in certain locations, meeting up, 2 or 3 groups meeting up in the spring or in the fall or so forth. But those are kind of the exceptions, and it seems like it was much harder to just physically find other groups of people to interact with. Whereas with cities and towns and sedentary agricultural life, suddenly you know that these people are going to be in the same location all the time, which obviously is going to do a great deal of the work towards developing this idea of trade and contact between different cities, between different groups of people, right? So that's one of the most important things, and why trade and contact becomes so important during the Neolithic Revolution, is because people are in one location. There's engaging with their natural environments to a much kind of greater degree than they had in the past, or much more intensive degree, I should say, than they had in the past. They're able to take advantage of those local resources and then go out and find other groups of people who have something that they want, give them something that those other groups of people need in exchange, and voila, you now have trade networks being developed and established. And even with the very early civilizations in Mesopotamia, you start seeing trade and contact between these cities and these towns and these villages becoming very important very early on. Of course, you also have the differentiation of labor, which you already talked about. A lot of you pointed that out. Increasingly complex political and social organizations. This is very important as well. Sorry, I've been going pretty strong there. I need to grab a drink. This is very important as well, because as the populations of these towns and villages, eventually cities, get larger and larger, you have people now fulfilling different roles and functions within the societies. More and more cooperation seems like it becomes a necessity, that people start having more and more complex ways of organizing themselves, which a lot of times is just kind of reliant upon having more and more people. For example, in one of these early villages, maybe you had, 15, 20 farmers coming in, bringing in crops every year to store in a central kind of community location. It'd be pretty easy to see who's bringing things in, what they're providing, what they're giving you, and so forth. When that number reaches 100, 200, 2,000 people who are bringing in, contributions to the city, or perhaps this is an early taxation system where you're trying to make sure everyone is paying in a certain percentage or a certain share, that's becoming a much more complex system to operate under. So this is really one of the first occupations you see within these societies are bureaucratic institutions. You have people fulfilling religious functions, you have people fulfilling governmental kind of bureaucratic functions, and eventually, as time goes on, you start having people fulfilling military leadership roles, as of course conflict is not outside of this situation as well. And it's kind of an interesting process that ends up taking place here. The earliest examples that we see in these villages and some of these large cities seem like there are sort of local governments, kind of like almost city councils almost, that are running them. Some of them we suspect are being run or very heavily influenced by priesthoods, more kind of organized religious groups. And that as time goes on and war and conflict becomes more common, one individual, kind of a military leader, was being appointed for a longer period of time. And it was only a matter of time before that individual, that military leader, began to kind of accumulate power for themselves. So you eventually start seeing the creation of the institution of kingship, which becomes very, very common in a lot of these early stratified agricultural cities, and you can really trace the increasing complexities within society and within the organization that is necessary to run society back to the higher populations created during the Neolithic. We already talked about the fact that there's increased inequality during this time period, but I don't think you can understate that enough, because we're going to be focusing on that and tracking it a lot of times throughout our class period here, and it's important to note that that is another kind of important consequence of the Neolithic era. Another very good aspect that people brought up were aspects of technology that get developed during the Neolithic era. And technology is very interesting as well, because just like you see societies getting more complex, a lot of times technologies, they're not just inventions that people think up for the fun of it. A lot of times technology is created or developed to meet a specific purpose, to answer a specific question, to solve a specific problem. And because now you're having more people living in a wider variety of ways, doing a wider variety of occupations, and that just larger populations are creating an increasing array of problems. Agriculture is getting more complex through the use of irrigation and so forth, that all of this is creating a lot of problems that people are trying to find good answers to. And technology is kind of built out of that. Once more, that's one of the things why when you look at these hunter and gatherer societies, it's easy to think or to conceive of them as somehow being less advanced, less sophisticated, less civilized. We'll be talking a little more about that in a minute here, because they didn't have what we consider today a lot of technology. I mean, they had kind of had enough technology to survive in the environments that they have, but there would have been relatively little use for example, someone who's living in one of these hunter and gatherer bands, to just randomly create something like pottery, which doesn't have as much usefulness in a group where you're constantly moving around as it does when you're in one set location and can start having a vessel to store grain and surplus goods in. That's really where pottery comes into play, and it's why it's only after kind of you start getting sedentary populations that you start seeing the creation of pottery, because people need more vessels and more jars to put their surplus in. And this is going to be something once more I'm going to reiterate when we talk about the last question here, the idea of civilization. People aren't stupid. People aren't just naturally dumb, and civilization isn't this just kind of one-track advancement from simple to complex. There's a lot of variety in there, and typically people are going to are very smart about things, and they know the environments they live in. They know what kind of lifestyles fit that best, and they are going to do what they need to do to survive within that context. And the hunting and gathering individuals were very good at surviving and living and spreading within the context. If you think about it, they were incredibly successful. They survived, like I said, for 90% of human history. A lot of times, using technology which we would consider today not nearly as advanced. They spread throughout the world to every continent except for Antarctica. They're from the densest jungles to the Arctic. And it's a testament of how successful they were in spreading and surviving, that in a lot of ways they didn't need a lot of what we'd eventually come to think of as kind of this technology or civilization or aspects of it, because it didn't make sense within their context. It wouldn't help them out in their daily life. It wouldn't make them any more effective at hunting or gathering. And anything on top of that would have been seen more or less as kind of a waste of time and made them less successful. But now that you start having sedentary agricultural societies, you start having more specific problems which need solutions, you now start having the increase of this kind of technology. So, for example, you look at pottery. Pottery, like I said, being used to store some of the surplus. Pottery made something else possible, which was the creation of beer, the fermentation of this grain, which you could then store in these pottery vessels for a long period of time, which has a very high caloric intake. It's safer to drink than a lot of water, and that it was a way to kind of preserve this surplus that you couldn't have done before. The wheel, the first example of the wheels that we know of were actually potter's wheels, trying to make more effective and uniform pottery, which eventually throughout time gets turned into being used for transportation as people found other ways to adapt it, but originally it was used for one specific problem. The creation of bronze, right, the mixing of copper and tin to create a harder alloy. First examples of it are seen in agricultural tools. Eventually, though, it gets turned into weapons. And I think the best example of this is writing. Almost uniformly across the board, the first examples that we see of writing are a lot of times bureaucratic in nature. It's people simply trying to organize the massive amounts of data that's coming in, whether it's figuring out taxation, whether it's figuring out contributions, whether it's figuring out who's what, who owns what, who is where. It's always based upon having to organize a lot of information and redistribute it. So that a lot of times it's only later that you start seeing the creative elements of writing being implemented. So if you're in a society that doesn't have this large bureaucratic system that needs writing, there's really no point to inventing it. A lot of societies that don't invent writing instead develop oral cultures, which are very well suited to fulfilling their needs of passing on information, of passing on history, legends, and so forth. They really don't need writing to do that because they have a more personal and effective way to do it. It's only through the problems that are created by the complexity of these large agricultural societies that necessitates something like writing. So all of these are examples of how things changed during the Neolithic era. There could be plenty more that you could add on to this that people did include, but for the sake of time, I chose to kind of focus on these particular aspects. All right, moving on down to number 3. I'm not going to go on in too much detail about this. A lot of people drew some really cool, really great maps, either creating them graphically on their computers or drawing them out by hand. Excellent job on these. I love the creativity. I love the different colors you were using to kind of mark the various zones and the rivers and the oceans and so forth. And as long as you generally had everything on the list on your map and everything was in pretty much the right location, I was giving you full credit for that. So thank you for doing that. All right, compare and contrast the natural environments of Mesopotamia and Egypt. What impacts did the environment have on the way society, culture, and religion developed in both locations? And this really is a great example of how important the environment increasingly becomes to civilizations and the direct impact that you can start seeing the environment having on how various groups of people, cultures, or civilizations develop. It becomes very, very important, and you can see it across the board in a lot of the cultures and civilizations we're going to be talking about throughout this class. So I like starting with this good comparison between Mesopotamia and Egypt because they both have very distinct environments which both impact them in very distinct ways. And I think the easiest comparison you can make, and this we'll begin back to this when we talk more about our primary source document, is rivers. The idea that the Mesopotamians had 2 rivers which were absolutely vital to agriculture and creating these large cities, but at the same point in time they were very, very unpredictable. They were prone to frequent and devastating floods and flooding coming from kind of the Zagros Mountains and washing down the Tigris or the Euphrates rivers, that the same water that was sustaining these cities and these people could oftentimes also be their downfall and their ruin and their devastation. And very unpredictable, leading to this idea of kind of a very chaotic perception of the universe. On the other hand, you have the Nile River, one of the most stable, predictable rivers in the world. And just like Mesopotamia being very, very dependent upon the Tigris and Euphrates, the Egyptians become very, very dependent upon the Nile. But the Nile gives them a very different perspective of the world. They have an idea of regularity, of order. The Nile floods about the same time every year. It goes down and decreases about the same time of year. The flooding is oftentimes predictable. It's not as haphazard or chaotic as the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, which leads to a lot of different ways that the Egyptians conceive of their sort of worldview. The boundaries, geographic boundaries, is another great example of the differences between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Mesopotamia is very wide open, right? There's a few mountain ranges around, there's a few deserts around, but in general, you can kind of get to Mesopotamia coming from the Mediterranean, coming from Central Asia, coming from the Arabian Desert, coming from Anatolia up the coast in what is modern-day Turkey, and that throughout its history, there have been lots of people who've come in from these various areas to conquer it, to trade with them. They're a lot more open, whereas Egypt is a lot more geographically contained. It's contained by the Mediterranean Sea. It's contained by the deserts on either side of it, either Arabian Desert or the Sudan. And it's a lot more insulated than Mesopotamia is. And this also ends up having some very drastic impacts. Also, each of them have very distinct natural resources. Of course, if you think of Mesopotamia, as our video series did a great job pointing out, you think of mud, right? That's the one thing that they had in mass supply that they were able to take advantage of. So they made their houses out of it. They rode on it. Anything you could think of that they were able to use kind of these mud bricks for, they were able to do, eventually making kind of these large temples and ziggurats out of it. Whereas in Egypt, you had a little more variety. You had a little bit more wood and timber. You had more stone. So there are differences in kind of the natural resources that these various groups had as well. So, what impacts did this have on the way that society and religion developed in both locations? Well, first of all, I think it's easy to say that, and you really can kind of see this reflected in the document exercise, Egypt had a much more optimistic outlook of the world. Like I said, they viewed the world as a very orderly place. Their gods had this very kind of stable succession mythology of, even though, the king or the pharaoh got killed, Osiris, he's eventually kind of mummified, resurrected. The pharaoh then on earth is kind of the next in line through mummification to become that god, and it's very cyclical, right? Also, if you think about the entire idea of Ma'at, it comes down to the idea of order versus chaos. Ma'at was a very, very important philosophy, which of course we talk about in a different question as well, around Egypt, and this idea that kind of the universe is defined by order and stability, and that humans should be reflective of that the political system should be reflective of that, the religion should be reflective of that, and society in general should try to maintain order. Compare that with Mesopotamia, where you have these chaotic rivers, you have a lot of these city-states always in conflict with one another. There's not kind of one centralized government that you see sort of developed oftentimes within Egypt. You have a lot of smaller fighting city-states. You have people coming in from other locations to cause chaos as well. And on top of all that, you don't know if your entire crop is going to be wiped out the next day or not. And this is very reflective in the religion of the two. Like I already talked about how you have this very kind of stable succession order within Egyptian religion, a very sort of orderly pantheon, whereas with the Mesopotamians, it's a lot more pessimistic, right? They view their natural environment as constantly going to kind of change on them. So the gods are very, very fickle, right? The gods seem very uncaring towards people. A really good example of this is in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Flood story. It's not in the version which I posted here, but one version of it has the reason why the gods decide to flood the human world and kill everyone is because humans were making too much noise. They're being too noisy, and the gods couldn't sleep. So the head god decides to just murder everyone, essentially. So it's this idea that just on a whim, the gods can, even if there's really no reason behind it, can try to just devastate people and wipe them all out. And of course, you had this idea of pessimism setting in, which the video did an excellent job of describing how the underworld for the Egyptians is a much brighter, more cheerful place, where in Mesopotamia, whether you're good, whether you're bad, it doesn't really matter. You're just going to go to the same awful place and eat sand and be thirsty all the time, and generally not have a good time. So you better have a good time while you're living, because if you're in Mesopotamia, you're not going to be having a good time in the afterlife. So you can really see how the natural environment is influencing these two. In religion, politics, the same way. You have a lot more infighting within Mesopotamia. The natural boundaries of Egypt make it a lot more susceptible to a stable one state that is controlled by a one ruler or one figurehead. Another interesting thing to think about is trade. Both these, Egypt and Mesopotamia, were very much involved with trade, but Mesopotamia, because of these kind of more open boundaries, was even more invested in trade, and that they were, in a lot of ways, kind of a hub for a lot of the other civilizations and cultures around them, in a way that Egypt, while still being very much tied in, did not quite achieve that same role. Of course, we want to look at architecture. Architecture, due to these natural resources and variation there within, very different between Mesopotamia and Egypt as well. So you can really see how the natural environment is, in a lot of ways, very much influencing the way that these two civilizations are developing, right down to what they're thinking, how they perceive the world, their religion, their politics, the government, and so forth. I was kind of disappointed. I actually don't think anyone went ahead and created any historic tweets for this week. Which I was hoping there would be a few people who are really pumped up about social media out there. I could get to do some fun innovations here. But unfortunately, everyone decided to take a more, scholarly approach to the questions this week, which is fine. So I decided to just go ahead and put in a Twitter conversation of what I think Sargon, Hammurabi, and Hatshepsut would be saying to one another. So we start off with Sargon saying, "Look how far this cupbearer from Kish has risen. Hashtag First Empire. Hashtag Inanna is Bay." Inanna being his head goddess there. Hammurabi responds, "Cool story at Sargon. Meanwhile, I am rocking out to my new law code. Hashtag Stele Rule. Hashtag Eye for an Eye." So getting his law stele in there and some of his conceptualization of his law codes. At Hatshepsut follows up by, "Move over, Mesomen. There's a new pharaoh in town. This time, it's a woman. Talking about shattering the stone ceiling. Hashtag temple building. Hashtag punt journey. Sorry. Of course, Hatshepsut, famous for building lots and lots of temples and kind of financing a exploratory expedition down the coast of Africa to the land of Punt to bring back more trade goods and so forth. So I don't know if these two lived in very different, or these three people lived in very different times, but if they were tweeting to one another, I kind of imagine it would look something like this. So just something for you to amuse yourselves with. All right, moving on down to deep impacts, and we're going to dive a little more deeply into this idea of Ma'at in Egypt. To describe the idea of Ma'at, how was this concept developed, and what role did it play throughout Egyptian history? And as I noted before, you really see this link to the natural environment, specifically to the Nile River, and how it created this idea and this ideology within Egypt that everything should be orderly and should be reflective of the natural processes of the Nile River, right? So order, stability within government, within religion, and in a lot of ways, I think you can look at the legacy of Egypt and why it was able to maintain itself in successive dynasties under one ruler for a long period of time, and why really, to a certain degree, this kind of ancient Egyptian culture that we can think of, even with a couple of intermediate periods, lasted for about 2,500 to 3,000 years. Very, very impressive the length that Egyptian culture lasted for. If you think about it, it's pretty remarkable because it's pretty much from the time of the Roman Empire up until today is how long this kind of one cultural group, with certainly variations, was able to maintain itself. And a large part of that was this idea of this constant link to the stability and the natural environment that the Nile River and Egypt provided. And we'll be delving much more deeply into this idea when we get to our document exercise. Alright, now and then, review the Epic of Gilgamesh. What elements of this story do you see in modern storytelling? Why do you think themes which were developed over 3,000 years ago still have relevance today? So first of all, let's look at the elements of modern storytelling. This is really, the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the first examples that we can see of the hero journey, right? This person who has supernatural powers going out there, fighting against supervillains like the giant Humbaba, fighting with a god or a goddess even in Inanna. If you want to take a look at our modern day kind of pantheon of Marvel or DC superheroes, in a lot of ways, they can be traced all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that people from that time period until today have come up with their heroes with supernatural powers, doing fantastic, incredible feats, Also, you kind of see the idea of a character arc with Gilgamesh, right? The fact that he starts off, in a lot of ways, being a very poor and a very bad ruler, and very harmful to his people, and through a course of time becomes a more sympathetic figure when he becomes friends of Enkidu, when he mourns Enkidu's death, when he goes on this journey to try to gain immortality for himself. He becomes much more humanized, and despite he's still this kind of god-type figure, you can start seeing a lot more of his humanity as the story progresses and it goes on, and he has a real definite character arc within the Epic of Gilgamesh. Once more, this is the same kind of storytelling that we oftentimes use and see in movies, in books, and in storytelling today. A lot of times you also see the kind of same questions about immortality, questions about the human's place in the world. What does it all mean? These kind of big questions. The Epic of Gilgamesh tackles all those, and in various ways we see all those a lot of times brought up and questioned as well. And also, it's funny, I like to think of it as being the world's first buddy cop movie, right? With Gilgamesh and Enkidu starting off as enemies, and then they become friends, and they go off and have all sorts of hilarious adventures and so forth. So you can think of it as kind of the first buddy cop story out there. But in a lot of ways, if you look at a lot of the stories we still tell today, very, very much similar to the Epic of Gilgamesh. So why is the story that was written and developed over 3,000 years ago still relevant? Well, we're all still humans, right? So in a lot of ways, the same things are important to us. In a lot of ways, we're still asking the same questions and looking for the same answers. We live in very similar life ways with the Mesopotamians. If you read through the chapter and you listened to and watched the videos, you'd notice that a lot of the inventions that they made, from timekeeping to some mathematical principles to just kind of in some ways the political systems and so forth, are all very, very similar to what we still have today. So it's not surprising that even stories that were written this long ago are still very, very relevant to us today. And in a lot of ways, this is kind of a precedent for what we see in other forms of ancient art, in religion. If you think of the kind of main religions in the world today, you see the same thing. They're developed thousands of years ago based upon cultures that are, in a lot of ways, very different than what we have today. But people today still find a lot of relevance within them. Philosophy, you can add on to that as well. So I think those are some of the reasons, why the Epic of Gilgamesh still seems, today like it's a very relatable story to a lot of people. All right, moving on to number 8. Think about Mesopotamian ziggurats and the Egyptian pyramids. What were the purposes of these megalithic structures, and what function did they play within society? What do you find most interesting about these structures? A lot of people did a good job pointing out the differences in the building materials between the pyramids and the ziggurats. The kind of limestone-shaped limestone bricks of large slabs from Egypt versus the smaller mud bricks from Egypt. The purpose of them, of course, was, even though they both fulfilled religious purposes, was different. Whereas the ziggurats were kind of more of a temple for people to worship. The idea that the gods were kind of living on top of them. The idea that they're supposed to kind of replicate the mountains of the Zagros where the gods are supposed to live, and bring those gods into the city for protection or for use in war with other cities. Versus the pyramids, which were there as kind of these large tombs to secure the afterlife for the pharaoh, to sort of fulfill that idea of Ma'at, of the pharaoh being able to make the successful trip and journey to the afterlife and fulfill kind of the religious function he was supposed to do. Or as time goes on, as the video pointed out, become giant billboards saying "loot here" for people who want to loot these as time went on. But a lot of people found very interesting the creation of the very early megalithic structures, how they're very similar, kind of a step pyramid versus kind of a traditional pyramid, trying to achieve kind of a vast height, which makes a lot of sense why you see pyramids springing up, not just in these two locations, but of course in the Americas and other locations around the world as well. And I hate to break it to anyone who's a big fan of the Ancient Aliens series on the History Channel. But aliens had nothing to do with this. It's the fact that if you wanted to make a large, tall structure in the ancient world, engineering-wise, there were very relatively few ways of doing that, and starting with a thick base and getting smaller and smaller as you go up is really one of the only ways available to ancient peoples in order to make real tall structures. So it's not surprising that a lot of people around the world, when faced with similar challenges, come to very similar solutions. And we're once more going to be talking about that aspect a lot throughout the class as well. And of course, kind of the labor that was involved in construction of these, a lot of people found that very interesting as well. That, of course, for the pyramids, they were built by pretty much volunteers who volunteered their time to the pharaoh to work on these, to build this monolithic structure. So yeah, a lot of people had great observations for comparing the kind of to the earlier examples of kind of monolithic structure building. All right, number 9 was a fun question. Given the choice, would you rather live in the Paleolithic small hunting and gathering band, a small early agricultural village such as Katal Hayuk, or an emerging large city such as Babylon? Make sure to explain your answer. And I love this because a lot of people, I'd say the class was almost evenly split between the three. A lot of people, looked at those advantages and disadvantages of agriculture that we talked about earlier, and a decent amount of people said, well, I'd rather just be in one of these small hunting and gathering bands. I wouldn't have to work as hard. I wouldn't have to worry about the social inequality. I think I'd fit better into that kind of grouping of people. Some people said just a small agricultural village, saying, will there be less social inequality in one of these? But I still like having the kind of safety net that agriculture and surplus provides. And some people said, well, a big city like Babylon would be the closest to my modern day life, and I relate to that lifestyle the most, so I'd want to live in a city like Babylon. You can really look at kind of the advantages and disadvantages that we talked about for agriculture to kind of depict where people want it to be. So it was cool just kind of seeing how people's individual personalities and what they felt was important to them in their own lives really was reflected in your decision on which of these three you would want to live in. For myself, it would be very, very difficult, I think, to pick one. I'd probably pick. Gosh, I can't even say. It's very hard. I'll say Babylon just because I think it'd be cool to hang out with Hammurabi. Even though if I did live in Babylon, I'd probably just be a farmer and not even get to do anything fun or interesting, and then eventually get wiped out by one of those devastating floods. See, look, some of that pessimistic Mesopotamian ideology has crept into me as well. But I'll go ahead and say my official choice would be Babylon. Although it might just be better to relax in a small hunting and gathering band. But still, overall, great answers. I loved your reasoning behind them, and a lot of people brought in a lot of good materials from the rest of the class to explain why they chose, which of the three. All right, finally, number 10. How do the various materials we have studied this week define civilization? What are some of its advantages? What are some of its limitations and drawbacks? And in the end, to what degree is the concept of civilization useful when viewing the past and thinking about the present? Well, I'm going to go off again here on a rather lengthy answer because there's a lot to unpack in this question. First of all, definitions of civilization. The book kind of gives the classic definition of what civilization is: a large-scale system of human, political, economic, and social organizations. Civilization have cities. Civilizations. Why don't we go ahead and... Civilizations have cities, laws, states, and often writing. And the author does a good job of pointing out that there's been a lot of questioning of this over the last 50 to 60 years or so, and not everyone is as comfortable with using this definition as to degree of what civilization is. And you see, once you study it in more detail and you start looking at kind of a comparative narrative of different cultures around the world, that there are a lot of problems with the idea of civilization. There's lots of cultural groups out there that have 2 or 3 of these things, for example, cities, laws, states, writing, and so forth. But not necessarily all of them. There's some groups that have a lot of economic and social organizations, but they don't have some of these other things, and that people aren't necessarily easily categorized into what you might think of as being civilized or uncivilized. And a big part of the problem with the very idea of civilization is that for so long in human history it has been used, and in a lot of cases the concept has been abused as a way of ranking people according to how much we like them and how similar they are to us, and groups that are less similar to us we accuse of being uncivilized, and groups that are more similar to us we say, well, of course they are then civilized. But that doesn't always match the facts when you're actually looking at the history. And in a lot of ways, this idea of civilization, or civilized or uncivilized, in the past has been used as a justification for treating people differently. In a lot of cases, treating people who are perceived as being quote-unquote uncivilized much more poorly, saying that people who are civilized have the right to exploit people who are uncivilized. So there's a lot of baggage that goes along with this term, and is one of the reasons why I think we have to be really careful in how we use it. So just an example, I think a much clear definition of what a civilization could be might be any large cultural group which engages aggressively with its environment. Because a lot of times what we see, and this goes back to the question that I was talking about earlier, is that people do what makes sense for them within their context. Writing, as I talked about, was a perfect example of this, is where writing really only makes sense in the context of having a large stratified state, and that if you're not living in a state that does a lot of kind of taxation and bureaucratic records, there's no sense or there's no point in developing it, as oral cultures can do the exact same thing that writing eventually does when you start getting to the more creative side just as well, and is in a lot of cases just as valid or just as useful for those cultures. But as time goes on, people who had writing looked at that as being kind of a litmus test of whether a civilization was civilized or not. But this runs into a lot of problems when you're looking at history. For example, the Mongols never created a writing system, but economically they're much more wealthy, politically they're much more powerful. They had more clearly defined states and laws than, for example, medieval Europe at the same point in time, even though medieval Europe had writing. So you can't really just use these kind of things that we think are like us to say these people were more civilized or less civilized than someone else. Because it's oftentimes a lot more complicated than that. And there's a lot of advantages and drawbacks to what even this kind of classic view of what civilization is or should be. And just like in anthropology, a lot of times people say any culture that kind of successfully serves that cultural group is legitimate, valid, and equal to all the other cultures. I would say civilization is the same way. As long as people are finding ways to engage their environment and make the environment work for them, it's hard to necessarily say one is clearly better or more advantageous than another, largely because of a lot of these advantages and these disadvantages that we're going to be talking about. So what are some of the advantages of civilization, at least this classical model of civilization? Well, there's large populations, right? We talked about how the Neolithic Revolution made these larger populations possible, and of course they only increase since then as the population of the world continues to grow and continues to grow and continues to grow throughout time, reaching the kind of massive quantity of 6-7 billion people we have on the planet to this day. Of course, resource surplus becomes a huge advantage, right? You can get lots of stuff in classical civilizations. You can build giant monuments, you can have lots of gold, you can have lots of large armies, you can have lots of stuff when you're in these civilizations, which people generally like stuff, so they tend to say that that is an advantage. But of course, that can also be a disadvantage as well, because a lot of times this stuff isn't divided in any case relatively equally, right? Some people always have more stuff than other people do. Also protection, right? In these large civilizations, there's a lot of other people around you within your kind of cultural group or within your civilization to provide protection in the early days from kind of animals or natural predators, eventually from other people who want to come in and take all the stuff that you have. Of course, there's a lot more trade and contact, and we talked about this, and this might be one of the legitimate kind of big advantages to civilization, that people are talking and creating these kind of webs of interaction with one another. And the big advance in that was the Neolithic Revolution, like I said, where people can be found in the same location over and over and over again, intensively engaging with their environment, using those resources to trade with other people, and through that, passing on ideas of technology, passing on ideas of religion, of philosophy, and so forth, where you start seeing a kind of combined knowledge being created throughout the world in certain cases, up until today, where you have, of course, the modern version of this, the World Wide Web, which a lot of this is kind of based upon the idea of civilization. Technology, of course, plays into that as well. I talked about how the larger a population is, the more kind of problems there are to solve, and the more inventive ways that people go about solving those. So a lot of technology is based upon, I would say, this kind of classic idea of civilization, but it's not limited to it, right? There's plenty of people who might not have checked off all of these boxes that had come up with lots of really good technological innovations that worked very well for them within their environments. And of course, the accumulation of knowledge. And some of this does go back to writing. But the same thing, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily limited to civilizations or cultural groups that have writing. There's plenty of other ways to have this kind of accumulated knowledge base. That brings us to the drawbacks. A lot of times, large civilizations can be very impersonal. It's very, very telling that even today, most people in their social groups have about 30 to 50 people who they would consider, pretty close friends, right? It's pretty hard to have a large social group that extends beyond 30 to 50 people. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that kind of 30 to 50 person range is the exact way that people have lived for 90% of our history in these kind of small hunting and gathering groups, and that it just seems like that's kind of more natural. So even though you do have large populations around you, you're really still only interacting real on a close, intimate level with a set amount of people, which means that the rest of the group and the population around you can be rather impersonal. And of course, when you add on the idea of structural organizations, social organizations, structures within society, it can only almost expand upon that. Of course, we talked about the labor demands and how much those increase through agriculture and the development of these civilizations, and that a lot of times you're having to put in more work to support these larger populations than you would having smaller, more decentralized civilizations. A lot of times there is increased inequality within these kind of classically defined civilizations. We talked about that a little bit. A much higher degree of patriarchal structures. There are oftentimes more institutionalized forms of slavery within these large agricultural societies. Slavery obviously exists in a number of societies that would not be kind of defined as these sort of classical systems, but oftentimes in those societies it fills a different role. A lot of times enslaved individuals are included into a cultural group or into a social group. Slavery is not hereditary oftentimes in smaller societies or cultural groups. And like I said, it's oftentimes used for different things as opposed to oftentimes large scale sedentary agricultural societies have a much longer track record of very strict and harsh social classes and institutions of slavery and forced labor to kind of meet these labor demands. Also, oftentimes these large sedentary agricultural societies demand a much higher level of cultural conformity, meaning that people are, of course, all expected to follow the same law, worship the same religion, think the same thing, serve in the same armies, which can have obviously beneficial sides because in some cases that can bring order to society. It can give people a sense of belonging and inclusion, but at the same point in time it can be a ostracizing mechanism too, right? For people who don't want to conform to society are oftentimes punished within that society. This leads oftentimes to there being a lot less personal freedom within the way civilizations are oftentimes defined. And of course, there is plenty of violence between civilizations as well, meaning that they can be very, very risky. In all levels of societies, it seems like there has been and there is presence of conflict and of warfare. But the idea of kind of violence and warfare on a large scale, certainly the violence scales with the size of the civilization. Let's put it that way. Up to the modern day, which we'll be talking about in a moment here, where with one push of a button you can pretty much blow up everyone on the planet, which I'd say would be a pretty big potential drawback. So this is kind of a comparison between some of the advantages and the disadvantages. You can see a lot of times the advantages can also kind of work as disadvantages. So that brings us to the last point of the question. In the end, to what degree is the concept of civilization useful when viewing the past and thinking about the present? And I would say that in a lot of ways, civilization should be a cautionary tale, right? That you have to be very careful when you're using the idea and the concept of civilization, that you're not using it to simply state that the people who you like or the people who are more similar to you are superior to or better than people who are less similar to you. That should really not be the way that you look at or define civilization, because as you look back at history, oftentimes you're going to find that to be inaccurate. Also, just to kind of play out this idea of advantages and disadvantages, I think you can take a look at the modern world as a way that both of these are playing out. A lot of people in answering this question said that because so much of the modern world was based upon this kind of classic view of civilization, at least within the United States and other, large state systems that we have around the world, which, like I said, most of the world is divided up to in the present day, that pretty much that means that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. But at the same point in time, you can look around the world today and see a lot of negatives and a lot of these drawbacks in full view. First of all, the idea of large scale devastating warfare. If you look at, for example, World War I or World War II, the Cold War, and how, like I said, through the development of nuclear weapons, right, trying to create technology to meet a specific purpose, in this case, fighting with your enemies, we're at the point now where, a few things go wrong, the entire world can essentially get blown up with the devastating amount of nuclear weapons which are out there. You have genocide being practiced on larger scales than what we've ever seen in history before, just in the last 100 years through the Holocaust, the Rwanda genocide, the Romanians, plenty of other places around the world as well. The idea of climate change, right? That there are people in their environments right now that are having a really hard time through smog and so forth. Sea levels do seem to be rising. There's people who are living in coastal regions which are having to evacuate their houses. And the vast majority of scientists agree that climate change does have something to do with human behavior. So as great as all this technology and these advances are, and a lot of people are linking climate change to a couple of the key staples of agriculture, whether it is methane being released through production of farm animals to feed us, or whether it is the technology aspect of it through cars and transportation, power and energy and so forth. That a lot of these are being linked to the changing climate, so it seems like we're potentially not having a very good impact on the environment, and a lot of this gets back to what we think of as these kind of classic advantages. Also, overpopulation. I mean, these large population levels that can be created with agriculture and in these civilizations is great, but eventually that gets to be not such a great thing when there just becomes too many people to feed. And the world's population is, like I said, higher than it has ever been in the world's history, and it looks like it's going to get much, much larger according to projections moving forward. And that this is eventually going to become a very real and very serious problem, potentially, that's going to have to be addressed. And as well as think about different aspects of health. You look at the influenza pandemic, for example, that sprung out at the end of World War I. People and the world in general, because it is such more trade and contact and interconnected with those kind of very tight webs we have now, we're at real risk that if something gets out that is kind of a devastating epidemic, it could potentially, wipe out a large percentage of the world and the population. And this has happened before in history. When Europeans who did have much closer contact to animals, did have a lot more of these diseases, came into prolonged contact with American Indian groups in the North and South America for the first time, who had much less close contact with animals and a lot fewer diseases. It was an absolutely catastrophic effect, which we'll be talking about later in the semester, but perhaps as many as 90% of the population of the Americas died as a result of these diseases, which completely decimated their societies and cultures within the Americas. Something like that could happen again. If it gets out, it's kind of been close a few times. You even think just a few years ago, the fear around the bird flu or the swine flu, even those didn't get to the level of kind of international pandemic, that potential is there because of just how closely connected everyone is. Other health concerns too, even if you want to look at the increase, for example, in diabetes, how a lot of what we're eating is very much different than what we ate in those kind of hunter and gatherer days, how oftentimes that still has negative effects on people, increase heart disease and so forth. That's an iffy one because there's certainly a lot of advancements that have been made, particularly in the area of medicine. And inoculations, and a lot of the reason for the massive population we have in the world today is that infant mortality has dropped drastically with the creation of these new technologies that we have had. But still, there are aspects that are making us less healthy today than we have been in the past. Diabetes, obesity, and so forth. So just something to think about, that even though we like the modern world that we live in, those drawbacks a lot of times are still there and still with us. And that some people very well might be happier living in one of these, pre-agricultural hunting-gatherer societies than they might be living in a modern state, particularly if they're not one of the people who are on top and don't have a lot of the advantages that certain people are born with. So it's just something to keep in mind, that as much as we love the civilization and the modern world that we have, we shouldn't use that as the lens to view all other civilizations in the past, and we should be still cognizant that it can be a cautionary tale. Okay, last but not least, let's wrap up by talking about our document exercise, the rivers of Mesopotamia and Egypt. So question number 1, what differences do you notice between how the Egyptians and Mesopotamia perceive their natural environment, particularly rivers? The first point I want to make here is that these two documents are talking about very different rivers. That seemed to be a confusion that some of you had this week. Some people thought that they were both talking about the Nile. That is not true. The Epic of Gilgamesh is talking about probably the Euphrates, could be talking about the Tigris, but the Tigris and the Euphrates River versus the Nile River. Completely different geographical locations. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. I'm going to put in I put in a number of quotes here. You could have used many more quotes than these, but this is just an example of what I'm talking about when I'm saying you need to include specific examples in your answer to these questions. And that's a big thing I reiterated in the email I sent out earlier this week, and I want to reiterate that now here as well. That a lot of people, if you lost points in the document exercise, it's because you were not providing enough specific examples from the document. So it's not enough that you just say there were these differences. You have to show me how, why, and where in the document is talking about these. So I'm going to kind of show you how I'm doing that here. It might have been different than the way you did it, but just to give you an example moving forward, kind of what I'm looking for. So a few key places that you kind of see this difference depicted here in the documents of how the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians are viewing their natural environment, I have put down. So in the Hymn to the Nile, they say right off the bat, "Hail to thee, O Nile, who manifests thyself over this land and comes to give life to Egypt." Right there you can see They love the Nile River, right? There is no delusion here that the Egyptians know where their bread is buttered, excuse the pun, that it is all thanks to the Nile River. He manifests himself throughout the land. He gives life to Egypt. Positive, right? They love themselves some Nile River. He is the creator of all good things, the master of energy, full of sweetness in his choice. Once more, all positive, love the river, creator of all good things. I don't know how much more positive or glowing you could get when you're talking about your river, right? They love the Nile. Where misery existed, joy manifests itself. All beasts rejoice. I love that line. Just this idea of like a crocodile and hippopotamus just sitting in the Nile, just loving it, right? This is just great. And, maybe they're even including humans in with that as well. I mean, we certainly know that they are in these previous ones. But the idea that joy manifesting itself, just loving this river so darn much. So that gives you a very clear idea that the Egyptians are really positive and have very favorable opinion of their river because of all kind of the natural bounty that it gives them. Let's compare that to the flood from the Epic of Gilgamesh. I saw the shape of the storm. The storm was terrifying to see. That doesn't sound very nice. That doesn't sound like the creator of all the good thing or joy manifesting itself. Second one. On the first day the tempest rose up, blew swiftly through and brought the flood weapon. Like a battle force, the destructive Kashushu weapon passed over the people. Kashushu weapon once more kind of being that idea of a flood weapon, right? Saying that the flood, the river, is just like a weapon. It's a devastating, powerful, natural force that they are clearly afraid of. For 6 days and 7 nights the wind blew. Flood and tempest overwhelmed the land. When the 7th day arrived, the tempest, flood, and onslaught, which had struggled like a woman in labor, blew themselves out. So really giving a clear depiction of the flood, the tempest, the onslaught. It's struggling like a woman in labor, how intense that was. Finally, it lets up, but it has already done so much damage by this point in time. So once more, showing a very different depiction of their river as being a lot more violent and a lot more unpredictable, being compared to a weapon, and definitely being perceived as a much more chaotic choice. A lot of people also picked up and noticed that there are very clear similarities between the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the flood story in the Bible. And of course that shouldn't be a surprise. The Epic of Gilgamesh, as far as you know, was actually constructed and written first, but the ancient Hebrews were in the same area, very close to Mesopotamia, a little bit closer to the coast along the land of Canaan, and it's entirely possible that the stories from the Mesopotamians influenced the later peoples in the region, including the Hebrews, who put a version of this down in their own religious text, which would eventually become what we know as the Old Testament of the Bible. So yeah, there are a lot of similarities that we see here in a really cool way that you can see how the cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt really did impact and influence those later societies and civilizations that came after them. But a great depiction here of the really different way that the Mesopotamians perceived the river as being hostile, being a weapon, being violent, being dangerous, and how the Egyptians view the river as being positive, as being the creator of all good things, as being joy manifesting itself, as being just about as positive about something as you could possibly be, right? Alright, so question number 2, what impact did these differences have on Egyptian and Mesopotamian culture, society, and religion? And I think it's a perfect example, like we talked about earlier, of Egyptian optimism based upon their natural environments and Mesopotamian pessimism based upon their natural environment, as well as the idea of Egyptian order and Mesopotamian chaos. You can really see the chaos manifesting itself within this story. I already talked about earlier how the kind of first version or one version of this flood story pretty much had the gods arbitrarily deciding to send this flood because humans were being too noisy. Well, on the other hand, the Egyptians are just pretty much saying it's all good things, right? It's very stable, and that's really depicted in a number of lines as well. It seems to be some really good lines you could have picked out to make this comparison for question number 2. For example, Hymn to the Nile, they view the Nile River as the establisher of justice. Mankind desires you, supplicating you to answer their prayers. You answer them by the inundation. Think about this, the idea of the river as the establisher of justice. Why would a river be an establisher of justice? If you think about it, that ties directly into the idea of ma'at, right? The idea of stability, of order, of justice. It's stemming directly from the river and how orderly and stable it was. So you see that kind of being directly parodied here with this line. Same thing, men exalt him like the cycle of the gods, right? This idea of repetition, an orderly cycle. You can see that with the cycle of succession, in the pharaoh in the afterlife, assuming the role of Osiris and his son then taking his place as pharaoh. You can also see that as the cycle of the river, right? Rising and falling, and of course, once more, this idea of maintaining order, of maintaining ma'at. Men offer the first fruits of corn, people praising and worshiping it in sacrifice. All the gods adore you. So even saying the gods of Egypt adore the Nile River. And keep that in mind because we're going to be talking about how the Egyptian or the Mesopotamian gods view the river, and even in their mythology, the gods look at the river in very different ways here. So those are some really good examples you could have picked out from the Hymn of the Nile. In the flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh, once more, a very different picture. The city was allegedly old when the gods within it decided that the great gods should make a flood. In this story, they just kind of randomly decide to send a flood to wipe out all of humanity, just kind of on a whim, which once more shows this idea of chaos, right? Nothing orderly about this. Even the gods were afraid of the flood weapon. They withdrew, they went up to the heaven of Anu. So you can see here, whereas the gods adore the Nile River, the gods in Mesopotamia, they're even fearful and afraid of the flood. Like, it's this idea that they kind of like sent this flood to punish humans, but it got a little out of hand. Like, they didn't mean it to be quite as devastating as it was. They felt threatened themselves, which is why they retreated back up to the heavens, so to speak. It shows you that even the gods, in the perception of the Mesopotamian, have a very different view and respect for the river than the Egyptian gods have. For all mankind had returned to clay, the floodplain was flat as a roof. All mankind had returned to clay. People had originally, in Mesopotamian mythology, been created out of clay. This means that pretty much all of mankind had been killed by this flood. So pretty hard to get more pessimistic and more different than that, as opposed to how the adoration being shown to the Nile River by the Egyptians. And finally, just to kind of show one more case of this kind of optimism versus pessimism idea between the Egyptians, look at this end of the tale of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Essentially, what ends up happening is one survivor, Upnapishta, ends up surviving the flood because he was warned by one of the gods to build essentially an ark, a large boat that he was able to bring his family on, and they were able to survive the flood. And after the flood, the gods sort of reward him for surviving by granting him eternal life. But at the same point in time, the gods promise not to send a devastating flood like this again. They kind of realize this got a little out of hand. We didn't mean to kill everyone, even though we decided to send this flood for various reasons, depending on what version you're looking at. But then they say, in the future, we're not going to send floods, but we're still going to be really mean to people. So instead of imposing a flood, let a lion come up and diminish the people. So wild animals can come and devour people. Instead of imposing a flood, let a wolf come up and diminish the people. Instead of imposing a flood, let famine be imposed and lessen the land. Instead of imposing a flood, let the era rise up and savage the people. Kind of a warfare idea here. Let people kind of kill each other through war or foreign invaders. So it's not a question at the end of the Epic of Gilgamesh of the gods saying, we're sorry we did this to people, we're not going to harm them anymore. It's saying, well, we won't send quite as devastating a flood, we'll just have all these other things to keep tormenting people with, which I think is a great way to show once more this pessimistic outlook that Mesopotamians have. So finally, in what ways does our environment continue to affect civilizations today? A lot of people did a really good job of describing a myriad of ways that we're still being impacted by our environments, whether it's the idea of climate change, which a lot of people brought up, whether it's the idea that there's large cities around the coast or large bodies of water, smaller towns in between there. whether it's just the idea of natural resources are available to certain locations, certain areas. They're going to take advantage of those a lot more. People are going to do a lot more skiing in Minnesota than they're going to do in Florida, right? That natural environment still continues to affect us a lot. I think in a lot of ways the degree to which the environment affects us might be even more impactful than it was in the time period we're talking about, because we're still dependent on the same processes of agriculture. But because agriculture is so much farther removed from most people's everyday life, it's a lot less noticeable, right? Because we don't have to think about, going out and working a field to get food, procuring our own food. The percentage of the population who are dependent upon creating food has dropped precipitously, at least within what we'd consider today kind of the Western world, within the United States today, within Canada, within Europe, and a lot of other places around the world as well. A very similar model. But that doesn't mean that's any less important just because we don't see it as much, because let me tell you, if we got to a point where the population gets well over the availability of food, or whether there's some sort of devastating natural change in climate that makes it there's a lot less food available, we're instantly going to be back very, very concerned about this again. And this could have even larger ramifications to the kind of civilization that we live in today, because I'll own up to it. If I had to suddenly just go out and start providing myself with food, if suddenly I couldn't just go to the grocery store and get food, I would have a really hard time of it. I think I'd have a really hard time being a farmer. I'd have a really hard time going out and hunting and try to surviving for myself. So I'm really, really dependent on other people doing these things for me. And if suddenly there was a change and I had to revert to trying to do something like that myself, and I think a lot of people would have a very difficult time doing so. So I think we're just as important, if not more, kind of reliant upon our natural environment as we ever were. But I think people are less aware of it now. And even some people in their answers here said, I think we kind of moved beyond this. We're not as dependent on our environment. I think just a few environmental changes could have some really drastic effects that would suddenly make people very well aware of just how important it actually is. All right. Excellent job, everyone. Thank you for your hard work this week. I think for the most part, everyone did a really good job. And I'm looking forward to reading your week 2 reflection activities. Once more, if you have a question about anything I discussed in our review video today, anything from the week 1 information, your grades, or anything else, contact me, let me know. Take care and have a great week.